President, I rise tonight to talk about an issue that is facing every single state represented in this chamber, every community in America. We've talked this week about the potential Zika epidemic. We've talked about the need for us to address that. I agree. But there's another epidemic that is already here, and that is this issue of prescription drugs and heroin, the addiction that follows, the overdoses that are too often occurring in our communities, the people who are losing their lives, and beyond the overdose deaths, the people who are casualties of this addiction, who have seen their families be broken apart because of the addiction and because the drug becomes everything, unable to go to work. We've seen the devastation in our communities in terms of the crime and the violence connected with the drug trade. And we have seen, unfortunately, babies increasingly being born with addiction. In every neonatal unit in America now, there are these babies. Certainly there are in my home state of Ohio, in every one of our hospitals. A 750% increase in these babies in the state of Ohio in the last dozen years. It's gotten to the point where deaths from overdoses from heroin and prescription drugs, opioids, now exceeds the deaths by auto accidents, the #1 cause of accidental death in my home state of Ohio. And based on the latest data I've seen, I believe that is now true for our entire country. Ohio's been particularly hard hit. We are probably top 5 in the country based on all the data I've seen, probably #1 in the country in terms of a particular kind of overdose from a synthetic form of heroin called fentanyl. It's devastating. 129 people on average die every day from these overdoses. This is why this Senate, over the last 3 years, has worked hard to pull together legislation that addresses this issue. Specifically says, let's figure out smarter and better ways to have better education and prevention, treatment and recovery to help our law enforcement be able to deal with this problem. We worked with 130 groups around the country, all of whom have now endorsed the legislation we spent 3 years putting together. We had 5 conferences here in Washington, bringing experts in from around the country. We didn't do it in a bipartisan way. We did it in a nonpartisan way. In other words, we didn't care who had the idea. Democrat, Republican, Independent, didn't matter. What mattered was whether it was a good idea and whether it would help to address this growing epidemic we're facing in our states and around the country. That legislation passed the United States Senate. It was on the floor for about 2.5 weeks. There was a long debate. But at the end of that debate, after people became familiar with this issue, some of whom already were very familiar, some of whom, frankly, were not in this chamber, but they would go home talking about this legislation. They were learning about it in their communities, in the schools, in the firehouses. They came back after 2.5 weeks of debate, and the vote for this legislation, called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, otherwise known as CARA, was not close. It was 94-1. That never happens around this place. It happened again because we took our time, we did it right, we focused on evidence-based treatment and recovery and prevention, stuff that actually works to improve what we're doing. It was responsible, but also because it's such a big issue in every state, every community. 110 days have now passed since the Senate passed CARA, 110 days. And by the way, I said earlier, 129 people on average are dying every day of overdoses. This means that in those 110 days, since the Senate passed the legislation, over 13,000 of our fellow Americans have succumbed, have died from an overdose of opioids. Think about that. Think of those numbers. So why isn't it done yet? Well, it's not done yet because the House needed to move its own process, and I totally understand that. You should know that the House was part of the process for the last 3 years. We made this not just bipartisan, but bicameral. In other words, both the House and the Senate were involved. We had about 130 co-sponsors of the CARA legislation in the House. But the House wanted to do its own process, and they did. And they came up with 18 separate bills rather than one more comprehensive bill. We're now in the process of putting those together. So 18 bills from the House, 1 bill from the Senate. The conference committee has been named. Today, I'm happy to announce that the conference is actually going to meet on Wednesday next week, and they're going to vote on the final product, which, having talked to a number of members of the conference committee today and over the past several weeks, I think is going to be a very positive product. It's going to be very similar to the Senate bill in terms of being comprehensive, but it also picks up a number of good items that the House added. One that I like in particular was raising the cap on how many people can be treated by Suboxone, one of the ways to have medication-assisted treatment in a particular treatment center. That's a good change. We do believe that the provisions that we included in CARA over here are necessary because it's comprehensive. It does include prevention and education. We think some of our prevention programs that are not in the House are necessary. We think that on the treatment and recovery side in particular, especially on the recovery side, there's some things that need to be added. I get very good reports as to the progress of that conference, and I believe it will be something that I can not only support but enthusiastically support if they can stick to the blueprint that they've worked on. Again, that vote will be next week. That's a good, positive sign. This is the 11th time I've come to the floor of the United States Senate to urge them to act. We have been in session for 11 weeks since the bill passed. Every single week I've come to the floor to talk about this, and I have the best report yet in the sense that we are moving forward. This week I sent a letter along with my colleagues, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Ayotte. This letter went to the conference committee to insist that the legislation be, in fact, comprehensive. And again, I believe that from what I'm hearing, it will be. The prevention grants, the National Opioid Addiction Awareness Campaign, the law enforcement task forces, the education grants to educate those who are behind bars, other great ideas, again, that came from both sides of the aisle should be included. I must say tonight, though, I'm hearing some other troubling reports. And these have now become public, so I'm going to talk about them. One is that although the Senate passed this bill 94-1, that although this is an emergency and an epidemic in our communities, 130 anti-drug groups from across the country have endorsed this legislation. Everybody's together. We've worked hard to make it inclusive. Again, 13,000 Americans have died of overdoses since this legislation passed the Senate. Despite all that, there are press reports that at the White House, they are encouraging us to delay. I hope it's not true, but here's the press report that I will tell you about. National Public Radio talks about a White House meeting with some Democratic members of Congress about potentially stalling CARA. One White House legislative aide is quoted as saying, quote, "We need to slow down the conference enough so that the White House can bring it back to the American people. We need help in slowing it down." The piece went on to say that Democratic members of Congress were asked to come to this meeting, and they were eager to help to slow it down. Slow it down? Are you kidding? Slow it down? We should have sped it up, and we certainly can't stop now. The Senate's only in session for 2 more weeks, then it goes out of session for the conventions and for the August recess. We should have already done it. Let's not slow it down. Let's speed it up. I would tell you something else that I learned today, which I found amazing. And again, I hope that the way I'm looking at it or the way I'm reading about it, it's not accurate. But I heard today that the drug czar for the United States of America, Michael Botticelli, who has testified in favor of this legislation, he came to 3 of our 5 conferences and testified in favor of it, and we took his ideas and his input, which were very helpful. He came to the hearing in the Judiciary Committee, and in response to a question from Senator Whitehouse, a leading Democrat on that committee and my co-author of this legislation, Mr. Botticelli said he thought this was a good bill. It was important to be comprehensive. He also went to New Hampshire for a hearing and said he supported the legislation in front of Senator Shaheen and Senator Ayotte. He was supposed to come to Ohio, but at the last minute decided that he could not attend our hearing in Ohio. I'm told yesterday he held a press briefing with Ohio reporters. I've been trying to reach him today unsuccessfully, but apparently he thought it was necessary to go to Ohio reporters to talk about this issue. Among those on the call, by the way, was at least one Democratic local official, maybe a few. I'm not sure because I wasn't told about the call to Ohio. I'm from Ohio. I'm the co-author of the bill. In that call, he said things that led the reporters to believe that he thought CARA did not go far enough, that it wasn't the appropriate response to this epidemic. Now, look, I understand there's an election every 2 years here in America, and that's fine. But I have known every single drug czar since the first one, Bill Bennett, all of them. I have worked with every single one of them. Many remain close friends. Barry McCaffrey, General McCaffrey, was the drug czar for Bill Clinton when I authored a few pieces of legislation with him: the Drug-Free Media Campaign legislation, the Drug-Free Workplace Act, the Drug-Free Communities Program, which has generated over $1.3 billion of federal funds, matching funds, helped spawn more than 2,000 community coalitions, including a community coalition in my hometown that I founded over 20 years ago. I've been at this a long time in terms of addressing this issue of drug addiction and drug abuse, and I've worked with every single one of the drug czars. I've never seen them be partisan, ever. So I'm very disappointed to hear these press reports about the White House wanting to delay. I'm now, of course, very disappointed to hear that the drug czar is out there saying negative things about the CARA legislation when he, in fact, was part of putting it together, and he, in fact, testified in favor of it. I don't understand that. I don't get it. Let's put politics aside and actually get something done here. Perhaps some of those parents who come to me and tell me about having lost a son or a daughter need to talk to some other members of the administration who think this is somehow a political game. This is about saving lives. It's about saving people from ruining their lives. It's about helping people to be able to achieve their God-given purpose. Our legislation is incredibly important. I mentioned some of the specifics of it. It does have grant programs we know work, evidence-based programs, medication treatment that works better. We know there's a lot of relapses. We're trying to get the money into things that actually work. But it's bigger than that. It's about changing our attitude about this issue here in the United States Senate, in the United States House of Representatives. I would think that anybody who follows this closely, certainly someone who is head of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, would get that. It begins to treat addiction like a disease that needs to be treated, just like other diseases. That alone, even if we didn't have $100 million in new funding in here, even if we didn't have all these new specific grant programs, the things we know work, like veterans courts and drug courts, and like all the recovery grant money that goes out, including to high schools and colleges for recovery groups that work, it would be significant just because it establishes this new approach, saying that addiction is not a moral failure, addiction is a disease. And through this, we hope to wipe away the stigma so people do come forward and get treatment, so families who won't talk about the disease feel comfortable in saying, you know what, you've got a problem, we're going to support you. We're going to get you into treatment so you can pull your life together, pull your family back together, and so we can pull our communities back together. That's what this legislation is about. This is an authorization bill, it's not a spending bill. Everybody knows that who follows this process. So apparently the concern that has been raised is, well, there's not enough additional appropriated money in here. Well, this is not an appropriations bill. By the way, the Appropriations Committee, at the urging of those of us who co-authored this legislation, have increased the funding substantially this year, and they have made a commitment in the subcommittee and in the full committee to have a 93% increase in funding for this next year. As I said, this authorizes about $100 million more every year going forward in our legislation as well. But frankly, the appropriations ought to be greater than that, I think. This is an emergency. But we're going down the right track there with these appropriations commitments that have been made. We need to be sure we have that commitment all the way to the final spending bills this year, because we do need to have adequate funding, particularly to make sure everybody who wants treatment can get it. I had to tell a town hall meeting this week where 25,000 people are on the call at any one time. It's a big group of people. And as usual, people talked about terrorism, they talked about jobs and the economy, but 3 different people called in on this drug abuse issue. 2 of them were recovering addicts. 1 was a parent. And they talked about the importance of the legislation, the importance of treatment, the importance for us to deal with this issue. They talked about the fact that this knows no zip code. It's not an inner city problem. It's not a suburban problem. It's not a rural problem. It is everywhere. I spoke to a woman named Lee from Zanesville, Ohio. She told me she's now in recovery. She volunteers at prisons, told me that most of the prisoners there are also drug users. We talked about the CARA recovery provisions, which include critical resources to develop recovery support services to individuals and families. We talked about the fact that in this legislation, we have grants that can go to prisons to deal with this substance abuse issue in prison, so when people get out, they've had the treatment to be able to get their lives back together and get out of that revolving door of the criminal justice system where more than half of the people who get out are right back in again within a few years. I talked to a man named John from Grove City. He told me he lost his son on June 1st, just a few weeks ago, to an overdose of heroin laced with synthetic drugs. I expressed my condolences to him and his family, but I also thanked him for calling and his willingness in front of 25,000 people to talk about this issue, and he was very plain-spoken. He said, "My son was addicted to heroin for 5 years. It meant more to him than his family. It meant more to him than anything," end quote. Unfortunately, there are fathers and mothers all over the state of Ohio who are experiencing what John had to experience with his son. He wants us to pass this legislation because he thinks it's going to help, and it will. I think those who are addicted, those families who are being affected by this, have been very patient. They're looking for more help from Washington, and they deserve it. Washington's not going to solve this problem. It's going to be solved in our communities, in our families, in our hearts. But Washington can help and be a better partner, take the existing funds that we're spending and spend them more wisely to actually affect the number of people who get addicted in the first place through better prevention and through better education, and then for those who are addicted, better treatment and recovery to let them get back on their feet. Washington can help. That's what this legislation does. It's making Washington a better partner with state and local government and the nonprofits who are in the trenches doing the hard work every day. Mr. President, I hope that these reports I'm hearing about delay and these tactics that are being used unbelievably by the administration to somehow make it appear as though this legislation isn't what they said it was back when they helped put it together and when they testified in favor of it. I hope that that's just a distraction and that people understand the significance of getting this done. Getting it done now. It's already past time. We can't wait. Again, people have been patient. It's now time for the United States Congress to face this issue, to address it through legislation that went through here with a 94-1 vote, to send it to the President for his signature, and more importantly, to send it to our communities around our country to begin to help turn the tide, save lives, and bring back hope. Thank you, Mr. President.